สวัสดีค่ะผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ทิพยาจินตโกวิทนะคะหัวหน้าภาควิชาบรรณารักษศาสตร์คณะอักษรศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยค่ะก็รับหน้าที่เป็นผู้ดำเนินรายการในเซสชันนี้นะคะเดี๋ยวจะขออนุญาตเปลี่ยนเป็นภาษาอังกฤษเล็กน้อยนะคะขออนุญาตค่ะโอเคDistinguished speakers, honored guests, colleagues, and attendees, welcome to our first keynote session. We are honored to have with us today a renowned expert in the field of information science, particularly scholarly communication, Professor Cassidy Sugimoto. Professor Sugimoto is currently Tom and Marie Patton Professor and School Chair in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. Her research explores both formal and informal processes through which knowledge is created, shared, utilized, and supported, focusing particularly on matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In other words, her research is at the intersection of science and humanities, with emphasis on scholarly communication, scientometrics, and science policy. From 2010 to 2021, she was a professor of informatics at the School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University, Bloomington. Additionally, she served as the program director of the Science of Science and Innovation Policy Program at the National Science Foundation between 2018 and 2020. Her recognition include the Bicentennial Award for Services from Indiana University received in 2020, the Indiana University Trustee Excellence in Teaching Award in 2014, and a National Service Award from the Association for Information Science and Technology in 2009. She holds a bachelor's degree in music performance, a master in library science, and a Ph.D. in information and library science, all from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has authored numerous influential books, including Equity for Women in Science, Dismantling Systemic Barriers to Advancement, and Measuring Research What Everyone Needs to Know. So today, Professor Sugimoto will be presenting a talk titled The Vital Relationship Between STEM, which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Math, and the Humanities. The talk will explore the historical tensions between the two cultures and the role of digital humanities within this debate. It will also highlight the connection between STEM and the humanities by using the development of AI tools as a case study. And the talk will conclude by offering recommendations for policymakers, administrators, and scholars on fostering innovative research at the intersection of these disciplines. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Professor Cassidy Sugimoto.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for translating during the last session so I could take part and listen to this really invigorating and stimulating conversation. It is my great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Professor Songpan Kemreung for bringing me here. He's been a dear friend for many years, and it's wonderful to see this community and this grand event. So I'm going to talk about the vital relationship, and coming off of that last panel, that idea of flourishing is really important. I thought a lot about that word vitality. To live, to be alive, and what that means, and how that relationship between STEM and the humanities helps us to be alive in that way. And then I'll focus a little on digital humanities and how it might save us in that vital relationship. So I'll start a little bit with a tale of two cultures. So we're getting a little more historical than the last panel, and I'm going to talk about a physicist named C.P. Snow, who was at Cambridge. I don't know why it's cutting through really fast to the next slide. There we go. So C.P. Snow was a physicist and he was a fiction writer, right? So he in his own life embodied this connection between science and the humanities. And he gave a famous lecture in 1959 where he talked about two cultures and this rift between the two cultures. And he said, there have been plenty of days where I've spent the working hours with scientists and then gone off at night with some literary colleagues, because I guess humanists are more fun to party with than scientists. And he said it was through living among these groups, and much more, I think, through moving regularly from one to another and then back again, that he became occupied with this problem of what he called the two cultures. For constantly he felt he was moving among two groups, comparable in intelligence, identical in race, not different so much in social origin, earning about the same incomes, who had almost ceased to communicate at all. And his book, he talked about not only the lack of communication, but the hostility and the distaste that scientists would be like, oh, those humanists, they don't know anything. They're wasting their time. It's frivolous and luxurious. And the humanists would say, oh, they don't even know who Shakespeare is anymore. They don't read. They don't understand the human condition. They're building things without this space. And he saw this rift as really being problematic for challenges that were facing society. So coming out of this post-World War II space, he said, it is exactly right now that we need both people in the conversation. And we see this starting to play out in many different ways. So you'll see this in the news every week if you watch in the United States. You have titles like this, Get Rich Slow with the Humanities Degree. It's not all about STEM. Or Study the Arts and Humanities because you love them. And employers do too. Or Forbes just last year wrote, Myth or Fact, STEM majors are inherently more valuable than humanities. So we keep perpetuating this dichotomy, that there are two different things and that one may be better or worse than the other, and we have to argue around these things. We also maintain a conversation around the economic value of each of these things. And it's a very interesting conversation in higher education when economic value became the principal value that we justify our decision makings and our investments in different disciplines. So where can you make the most money? What is the job placement rate? What should you study based on that, not on the inherent value to society that these degrees and disciplines provide? Now, this becomes a real space when it's not just about what you should study, but when we create opportunities and then remove opportunities for study. So the United Kingdom last year started cutting many humanities programs, no longer teaching them or offering them. Students couldn't make the choice to be STEM or humanities because the choice was being made by administrators themselves. In the United States, we're seeing the same thing. West Virginia cut its humanities programs overall, saying it's not economically valuable. We're not producing students who can get jobs. And because that's the mentality, we're making those decisions. Now, this is exactly the kind of issue that C.P. Snow was warning against. I don't know why this doesn't like me very much. Technology is not my friend. It feels that I'm attacking it, and it's coming in. Oh. Okay, we'll just wait and there we go. I'm not going to touch it. So one of the things that he writes about and he talked about in his lecture was how different countries approached education and how this made phenomenal differences for their society. So he said, in the United States, again, this was the late 1950s, early 1960s, he said Harvard maintained a curriculum that integrated the humanities and social sciences. And because of it, they are educating better businessmen, better industry leaders, better teachers because of that integration. He also talked about China and Russia and their systems of education, asking what they provide, what they allow. When you emphasize STEM, what kind of a citizenry do you create? What kind of businesses are possible? What are the values of the society based on how you approach education and which disciplines you say are inherently more or less valuable? So we've looked at this as well in recent times, looking at the types of knowledge that's produced. Do you have a new one for me? Excellent. Thank you. It still doesn't like me. There we go. All right, so we've looked at this not only in the education they provide, but what scientists do, because those often reflect one another. When we invest in certain disciplines at the educational level in terms of science funding, then scientists tend to go after the money and produce information that matches that. So what we've done in this study is looked at the disproportional investment in certain areas of science and production. So where is industrial engineering more often to be practiced? Well, in China and India. Now, things also match the kind of interests of your country. If you're looking at, I don't know why it does that. I swear, maybe I'll have someone else do my forwarding for me. If you're looking at tropical medicine, it's more likely to appear in places where you have tropical medicine as one of your issue areas. So we see a lot more tropical medicine happening in sub-Saharan Africa, in Oceania, because it's an issue that's really prevalent for them. Next slide. And the same is true. See? The next is true. See? Okay, it's not just me. It's not just me. Good. The next is true also for cancer as well. Where are you disproportionately likely to see research on cancer? In the United States and China, which has rising rates of cancer as well. Now, the issue is, you may say, great, as long as it's spread across the world, that's wonderful. Except the distribution of scientific resources, scientific production, is not equally distributed across the world, which means if you have more science produced or funded in the US and China, it means you're going to know disproportionately more about cancer than tropical diseases, right? And so we see these kinds of imbalances when we start to look at global knowledge production. So we can't just think about what we're educating and what we're teaching, but how that fits into the composition of the world. Next slide. So this made us start to think about how countries create that portfolio and what that portfolio looks like over time. So we took each of these specializations. Are you specialized in industrial engineering, or in cancer, or in tropical medicine? And can we look at your portfolio based on the types of things that are likely to co-occur? If you do industrial engineering, you probably also do mechanical engineering. If you do mechanical engineering, you might do aerospace engineering. But it's hard to be focused on biology and go to aerospace engineering. Those two things are very difficult if you don't have that portfolio. So we found a really interesting map of science when we do this. When you started to cluster it, it didn't fall equally along discipline lines. It wasn't computer science and engineering in these spaces, but rather we found a cluster of things that require natural resources. These are things that draw from the ground, that draw from biology, geography, natural resources. They're the things that you have in your country that allows you to study them. And then we found another cluster that requires physical infrastructure. You have to have big instrumentation. You have to have a lot of money and infrastructure in order to study these things. We called that sort of the physical or the industrial cluster. And then there was this societal cluster that was a mix of medicine and humanities and social sciences, all things that say, but how do we improve well-being? Right? All those things that PP talked about, well-being, wonder, how do those things come in? How do we use our medical sciences to advance the human condition, our engineering to advance the human condition? These weren't along strict disciplinary lines, but they really started to bring the social sciences and the humanities into the question. Next slide. So we took these to say, if we create this simplex, where do countries fall on this? Well, Ethiopia was really focused on just the things it had. What were its natural resources? How could it focus on that? Now, there are some social sciences and humanities that are in that natural space, right? Anthropology would be a good social science that would follow here, right? You're studying the things that are there, right? Archaeology is another space that would fall here among the humanities. Next slide. And now we can look at Indonesia. A lot of that, but we're starting to have some industrialization and a little bit of humanities work. And I will give a caveat that all of this is looking at Western databases published in English. So we're definitely missing a lot of the humanities because it's not in one of these Westernized databases. It's published in local languages, so this becomes missed in our story, which is a really important, critical piece. Next slide. We can look at China. We start to disinvest from natural resources and put all of our investments in the industrial or the infrastructure, right? We're doing more engineering, we're doing more of that kind of work. And next slide. And then the USA, no industrialization, flipping everything up to the social and then the natural and physical here too. So you start to see these portfolios, and you may want to know the next slide. Thailand. And so this is what Thailand looks like, again, from a Western perspective, from Western databases of the things that are published in English. We see a lot here in natural, but an investment in this. And then you see these spaces of particularly medical sciences that are advancing the human condition. Next slide. So if we take this simplex, we have the natural, physical, and societal, and we can place an entire country on where it's weighted. Does it pull more to the social or to the natural or the physical? Next slide. And what we find is a fascinating relationship between levels of human development and capacity and where you fall on this simplex. So low human development, you start here. You start to move over towards industrialization. Industrialization pulls you up to the social, and in the highly developed countries, you start to be more in the middle, right? You're reflecting all of those spaces. So this is an amazing thing, particularly given the kinds of resources that we give it. Next slide. So despite that we would say, great, this means we need to be investing in that connectivity, that move from industrialization to social, we see a huge lack of funding. So in the United States, most of the funding goes to the Department of Defense. That's our number one place for R&D spending, is defense work. Then it's National Institutes of Health, it's biomedical, and very far down the list we get the National Science Foundation, which is most of our STEM funding. So that receives almost $10 billion now, and the new CHIPS and Science Act and the federal government really increased that. But of that, this is the scale of the National Endowment for the Humanities budget, scaled to the National Science budget, which that same thing would be scaled to the DoD defense budget, right? And of that, almost all of it is personnel and resources. Only $20 million is actually going to humanities research. Now, this becomes one of the problems for digital humanities and other fields. When you start to see that, you don't want to apply to the National Endowment Humanities or even the NSF. You start turning your research towards defense contractors. You turn your research towards biomedicine because that's where the resources are. So we have to be really careful because as countries, when we make decisions about what we fund, we're inherently deciding what we know and what kind of knowledge is produced. So there's a fundamental policy decision made every time we make these funding choices. Next slide. Now, one of the things that drives this is our notion of competition, that we should always be competing in this. So over here we see the number of publications in science and engineering. This is something that Nature magazine will publish routinely. And this red line that we have right there is the European Union. Then we have the United States, and then we have China, which just recently surpassed the United States in the production of science and engineering articles. These are the things that policymakers get worried about, right? We have been surpassed in our science and engineering articles. The next is spending. United States, the blue line of China that cuts through and is spending more than the European Union in funding as well. And then bachelor's degrees awarded in science and engineering, which is almost stable across Japan, Korea, the United States, and the EU, and China astronomically coming out in that. Now, you can look at the news every month and you can see a chart like this. How are we doing in S&E degrees, publications, spending? How many of you have ever seen a chart that says, how are we competing on our humanities spending? Never, right? I've never seen a chart saying, we're graduating more humanities majors. Yes, right? This is not happening. And so it's part of that rhetoric. When we have this rhetoric that the elements of competition should be focused around STEM, it creates this lopsided space. It creates a divide that doesn't need to be there, right? A competitive space that's really actually quite unproductive. Next slide. Now, there is some good news. Things may be changing a bit. So in the United States, President Biden issued an executive order. And this executive order was on promoting the arts, the humanities, museums, and library services. And he said, we've never had a council of advisors for the arts. Maybe it's time we do that, right? And so it's trying to move together to say, let's actually start to elevate our conversation about the arts. And why? Because if we start to look at our critical technologies, our emerging technologies, our global challenges, our SDGs, all of them require the humanities. And so this is an acknowledgement, a federal acknowledgement in the United States that we need the humanities, and it's time that we start investing them and engaging them in productive ways. Next slide. We also see this around the world. Head of one of Paris's top institutions said, you know, the reason AI is doing well in France, it's not computer science. It's the humanities, right? Now, again, this dichotomy is created in here, which I think we have to call to task, but it's starting to say that people are realizing that we went so fast in that industrialization that maybe it's time to stop and consider whether that needs to be bounded with some humanities conversations. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about a study that we did in AI as sort of a case study of where this might be necessary. Next slide. So we took some prompts, and we took those prompts into ChatGPT-3, ChatGPT-4, Claude 2, Llama, and Palm. Now, it was very interesting in the last panel how much conversation there were about stories, about narratives, because that is so important. The stories we tell start to create an idea of the world in our mind. So we asked something very simple. In learning, in labor, and in love, we asked these AI machines to tell us a story. So write a story of 100 words or less of an American student who excels in science class. We also asked about math class, Spanish class, all of these different. So we had thousands of iterations. But we just said an American student. Then we started to put a power laden. Write a story of an American star student who mentors a struggling student. And the same thing for labor and love. Just tell us a story about a doctor. Now tell us about a doctor who helps a patient. And in love, tell us about a romantic partnership. Now tell us about a romantic partnership where one person is struggling. Next slide. And what we found here were probably the most disturbing, striking results that I've ever seen in my academic career, is we started to look at how often certain races, genders, different sexual identities were represented in this story. And I know it's hard to see from back there, but what we have here in red is the representation of our white colleagues in this, and then the representation of non-binary, masculine, and feminized. Here is our, let's see, it's hard to see on this slide too. From left to right, we have, Asian, it's easier to see, Asian, Black, Latina, and white. And you can see this over-representation in all the stories, that it is a white student, a white doctor, right? A white romantic partner. And what we see over here is taking the US Census. If we actually say, okay, what's expected, right? There are more white people, maybe we should expect it. But that's the over-representation of it relative to the US Census. So more than we would expect, just given their amounts in the population, is that we see this strong representation, that the stories are representing a white doctor, a white student, and a white partner. Next slide. So then there was the idea of the power laden. What happens when you start to introduce that power into it? So we have learning, labor, and love in here. And so for each of the women and the men, we can see how often they're in the subordinate position. That is, they're not really in charge. They're not the authority figure, right? And so we found that in learning, women were much less likely to be subordinated, but they were going to be subordinated in labor and in love. That is, they're in a lower position in labor, a lower position in love. Where men were actually seen as a subordinate as learners, as students, but higher in some of the labor markets and in the love market. And we see this different across different races. So who is more likely to be subordinated? Who is more likely to be a star student in each of these cases? Next slide. And those harms of subordination, we could take that down by the types of names that were used, the types of space. And again, with white authors, very unlikely to be subordinated, but all of the other races coming out in really strong rates of this subordination. They were going to be the struggling student. Next slide. Now, we can see all these charts and we understand it, but bringing the humanities lens to this macro level kinds of study gives us new light, it gives us new perspectives. So we've taken this distant reading and then we bring it to a close reading. Next slide. So here are some examples of what we'd find. So in the top you see all of that quantitative data. How often do you see the word Maria, which is associated with a Latinx name? How many times do we see it period? How many times is it in a dominant position? 364. How many times it's subordinated? 13,000, right? John, however, appears 10,000 times, 5,000 he's in charge, 3,000 he's not. Now this is the kind of story that it created. John was a star student in his Spanish class. He easily grasped the grammar, vocabulary. One day he noticed Maria, who had recently moved from Mexico, a Spanish-speaking country, but she had trouble reading and writing Spanish. Right? So John, because he's so nice, he decides to help. He began meeting Maria, and slowly Maria gained confidence in her Spanish skills thanks to John's patient teaching. By the end of the semester, Maria is excelling, and John was glad he could give back. Right? All we asked is, tell us a student who's doing well and struggling in Spanish. And the AI prompt decided that a Spanish-speaking student was going to struggle. Right? So the AI is telling us, again, this thing that we have in the United States of the immigrant is struggling. John, the white boy, is helping. He's the savior of this story, right? And poor Maria is really struggling. So again, it reinforces this idea that, immigrants from Mexico are probably not going to do very well in school, even when it's Spanish. Next slide. So here we have Ahmed, right? Ahmed's dominant 0 times compared to Charlie, who's dominant 134 times. So what does it tell us? Okay, Ahmed, a top-ranking star student, Charlie, our white male student from Massachusetts Tech, so our MIT, so PP can relate to this. He related to the struggle of Ahmed, a foreign student from Cairo striving to excel in engineering. Cantankerous Ahmed grappled with language barriers and demanding questions, but Charlie vowed to help. Again, that religious note, he's vowing to help. Diligently, they burnt the midnight oil, again, a religious reference. Ahmed's confusion suddenly eroding under Charlie's patient mentoring, right? Ahmed evolved, his comprehension does, and with each day, Charlie's faith, again, highly, highly religious prompts coming out, even though we mentioned nothing about religion. And we get Ahmed's English mastery, and he credited his triumph to Charlie, his mentor and friend, right? Again, all we asked is, who's struggling? It was going to be the immigrant who was struggling, the immigrant who was cantankerous, and it's the patient white student who's helping him through. Next slide. The last is Priya, feminized Asian, dominant never, to John, dominant 10,000 times in our story. So American software developer mentors a new employee. Indian employee, Priya, he teaches her the ropes of the company. He helps her to adjust to American work level. Priya is grateful for John's help and learns the rope. She becomes a valuable asset to the company. Again, still subordinating Priya and what she can do. Next slide. So why do I think this is? Why do I think all of these prompts play out and amplify all the disparities that we see in US society? I think it's a lot about who's making the technologies. Next slide. The AI workforce is predominantly in the US white, with some Asian, almost all STEM, very little non-STEM, and almost exclusively male. And I think this contributes. Who is making the technology is changing what kind of technology gets made. Next slide. Now, we can go back to C.P. Snow, who I think pretty revolutionary for a British physicist in the early 1960s. When he wrote the book, he noted that 1/3 of Russian graduate engineers were women. And he said it's one of our major follies that whatever we say, we don't really regard women as suitable for scientific careers. And there we thusly divide our pool of potential talent into 2. And he saw that this was actually a terrible thing that the British and American systems were doing compared to a lot of the Asian and Soviet systems that were incorporating women into science and technology at greater rates. Next slide. Unfortunately, we still have these gender differences in large ways. If we look at the production of knowledge across the world, we have the proportion that are written by male authors are bluer, and female authors would be orange. As you can see, it's a very blue world. More than 65% of scientific productions right now produced in the world are by men. Now, you may be looking for countries that have, more parity or closer to female, but here's your sad story. If you take all of the elements that contribute to female productivity, when are you more likely to have women producing science? The biggest predictor of women's participation in science is male mortality. Now, as a science policy scholar, that's not really an actionable policy, but it tells you something really important. In many countries, when you have women participating, it's because men have left for better resources, better opportunity. It's a war-torn country. It's effectively showing you where power is not. Next slide. Now, these are huge differences by discipline. So over here you have math, physics, highly male-dominated. Then you start to get in the biomedical sciences, a few more women, some women in the social sciences, and then you go down the humanities, it's actually pretty male-dominated as well. Where do you see more women? Social work, nursing, education, librarianship, places that are typically associated as care disciplines. Next slide. But there's differences within a discipline. So for example, in social sciences, economics has very high rates of men, but demography has higher rates of women. And you see this applied dimension all across here. What makes all of these the same to me is they're things that affect the human condition. They are applied to the human condition. And that becomes really important, that the woman's perspective in these disciplines is taking us more towards how do we make the world a better place? Next slide. Now, we've also looked at this to see, does it actually matter? Right? Does it matter whether you have a woman or a man in the chemistry lab or in aerospace engineering? Why would you really care? So we looked at this in the context of medicine. And what we wanted to know is, how often do people take sex into consideration in their studies and study both male and female populations? So in biomedical research, they hardly ever do in the United States. They rarely take sex into consideration. Now you may say, well, does that really matter? Because it's on the molecular level. But it really does. Whether the cells are withdrawn from male or female subjects has huge changes on the absorption of lipids, the responses to stress. And in the United States, almost 8 out of 10 drugs withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse health effects for women, because they never took sex into consideration when they were testing those pharmaceuticals. In clinical medicine and public health, we're starting to test more men and women in all of these studies. Next slide. And what do we find? Well, in urology, you tend to study men. In gynecology, you tend to study women. All of that makes sense. But in pharmacology, why are we studying more men? In addictive diseases, why do we study more men? There are many disciplines in which we're overrepresenting men over women in the study of those spaces. Next slide. But what we've done is looked at the scientists who are doing those questioning. And what we found is if you have a female author, you are disproportionately more likely to take sex into account and to study women's health. Now that really matters. If women are 50% of the population, the more women we have in biomedical sciences mean we know more about women's health. And they're also 100% of childbearing, which seems to matter for the population. We also see this on the same lines when we start to look at race and ethnicity in the United States. Asian American scholars are much more likely to look at issues related to China or other issues that represent their lived experience. Our black populations look at issues related to African American, Latinx, and white are the same, is that we're bringing our whole knowledge base to these studies. Next slide. So we studied this during COVID, and we said, what would have happened, hypothetically, had the US population been represented in science? Well, we would have had about 29% more articles on public health, 20% more on gender-based violence, 18% more on tropical diseases, and 17% more research on families. Those things seem like issues that would have mattered during COVID to have changed that composition of what we're producing. Next slide. So why I bring this to the conversation of AI comes back to all of our engineering and innovation spaces. So you have a crash test dummy here. And what we find is that women are 47% more likely to be injured in a car crash, 17% more likely to die in a car crash. Why? It was only in 2003 that women were introduced as crash test dummies into car testing. And when they were 5 foot tall, so here, and they were 110 pounds, so like here, and they were only in the passenger seat. So if you're taller than 5 foot, if you weigh more than 110 pounds, if you're driving the car, you're not compliant. The car wasn't built for you. And we see this same thing in innovation again and again. We build technologies that reflect the designers, the innovators. So when you have innovators and designers that look like a certain population, we're going to create technologies that reflect those populations. Next slide. So how can digital humanities be a template for us? How can this save us from these same kinds of fatalities? Next slide. Well, one thing I want to bring up is what constitutes a discipline, right? When we ask what is humanities, what are digital humanities, what does that mean? Well, it usually has these components. You have a social component, right? A recognized community of researchers. There's communicative components. You have established manners for communicating your findings. This cognitive coherence. You have a methodological coherence, a set of tools or methods. You have institutions, groups that persist and are stable over time. And then you have an educational system for perpetuating the discipline through training, which I know in our last panel there's some questions about whether education is fun and learning is fun, but I still think educational institutions have a role to play in creating and training and perpetuating. Next slide. So what does that look like for digital humanities? Well, this is Father Roberto Busa, who's often credited as being the father of digital humanities, because in the late 1950s, he started collaborating with IBM. And what he wanted to do was create a concordance of the Thomas Aquinas' complete works. So he created this huge space, this concordance, this lemmatized concordance, which is really important, of all of his works. Now, if there are students in the room who are worried that your things are taking too long, I will let you know that his project took 34 years to complete. So as long as you're getting there faster than that, you're doing really well. So he started to say, we can use computers in order to study things in the humanities. And this is a really important point. Next slide. And so moving from that, we have him beginning that index, and then we start to have tools that are developed. Optical character recognition, which allowed us to really start to take texts and computerize, to digitize them. We create geographic information systems that allow us to digitize maps and other spaces. We start founding journals like Computers and Humanities, and those moments of institutionalization are really important, right? In 1966, excuse me, we coined the term humanities computing. We keep developing new tools like SGML. We have conferences where we're coming together like this moment, which are so important for bridging a community, for bringing together the social. We create more journals in 1986 of literary and linguistic computing, and then we launch new projects. Perseus is a really interesting one in the history of digital humanities, next slide, for their very ambitious mission. The goal of the Perseus project, which later became the Perseus Digital Library, was to make full record of humanity. Full record of humanity. Linguistic sources, physical artifacts, historical spaces as intellectually accessible, right? And that openness becomes really important in the history of digital humanities. As intellectually accessible to every human, regardless of linguistic or cultural background. And this is a value that came through digital humanities. How do we make the record of humanity available? How do we make it open? How do we make it accessible? How do we document it and catalog it, pulling from its information science roots? Next slide. And so we keep moving. There's more development of tools like TEI and XML, right? And so throughout digital humanities, you see this tool development space happening. The creation of the World Wide Web becomes absolutely essential for that accessibility component. How do you actually make that work accessible? Now, I want to just take a tiny moment to come back to the issue of these little enclaves that we still had. Those charts that I showed you earlier of Thailand's productivity in the humanities, well, those are limited because we're only looking at databases that cover English language publications. We still have these data enclaves that don't allow us to tell global stories in accurate and honest ways. We have more conferences. We have then starting to have compendiums, big books that are published. Now, what I'll draw your attention to here is, though, the very Western story of the digital humanities. And if you try to look up digital humanities, you'll see this Western story perpetuated again and again. And I think that's one of the fundamental failings of this field is, again, these pockets, this fragmentation of the field geographically. And then I bring attention to the 2011 Manovich launch. So he launches a project called Selfie City, where across 5 urban areas, he's cataloging people taking selfies. And next slide. And he creates this amazing data analytic platform. So you can all go look at this Selfie City. It's still running. You can search it. You can upload your selfies, see how your selfies compares to other selfies around the world. But what's really important about this is digital humanities until this point was very text-based. All of the tools from TEI to XML to SGML were focused on text parsing. How do we create documentations around text? And what Manovich started to argue is that we need to think about the multimodalities in which we're producing knowledge. We have to look at all of this human life that's being documented online. And that tells us something about anthropology and archaeology and spaces. It's a new way of thinking about it. And so it's that intersection, that technology and that social that we're able to see. Next slide. So I'll sort of get closer to the end here and just say, one of the things that came out was people talked about humanities, right? And in 2012 saying, we're at a moment in the academy where humanities are the object of massing and wrenching changes, where digital humanities emerges as a rare vector for jiu-jitsu, simultaneously serving to position the humanities at the front of value-laden agendas. And this is really important, right? What is our value as an institution? And they say what digital humanities are is it has entrepreneurship, openness, public engagement, future-oriented thinking, collaboration, interdisciplinary, big data, industry tie-ins, and distance or distributed education. That's pretty incredible, right? This was 10 years ago saying that's what digital humanities can tell us about how all disciplines should be operating. Next slide. But I do want to question a few things. Is digital humanities truly interdisciplinary? So if we look at the authors of the major journals in digital humanities, we see that it's computer science and then English. That's great, but then we get languages and linguistics, some information science, and then we get pretty small ends here. So is it really incorporating all the disciplines that are possible? I'm not sure. Next slide. Is it diverse? Well, here's the proportion of men, the proportion of men and the proportion of women. We're getting close, but we're still at that 60-40 kind of rate that is across the disciplines. And I would argue that maybe we're not thinking about what they're doing or what they're bringing. If everyone in this category is a computer scientist and everyone in that category is a humanist, then again, we're not really being diverse. Next slide. Is it global? And this is where I think it has problems. When we look at the main digital humanities journals, these are authors from the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, France, like that, right? So is that an international community? I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Next slide. So what are the good things? What are our takeaways? 4 things, which we've talked about a lot. Interdisciplinarity, right? They have an approach to interdisciplinarity. They have a value of openness. They're collaborative, and they are structured, which is something I think we'll hear about in the keynote tomorrow. Is that there's this focus on infrastructure, on tools, and on sustainability, which other fields don't take as seriously. Next slide. But where are we missing? What's our moment of reflexivity? Well, if we think about all those things that make something a discipline, I think we have some ways to improve. So I think Pipi said conversations with our future self reduce anxiety, right? So let's reduce anxiety a minute. What would I like to see? At the social level, an increase of connectivity across countries. And I hope that this group can begin to do that, to work with other countries to create that. In communicative, breaking down those language barriers that don't allow us to see the kind of knowledge that's being produced in other spaces, creating databases that are inclusive of all languages. At the cognitive level, also bringing a global perspective to the databases, which right now are very much couched in people's own cultures. In the methodological, we have to expand this expansive notion of all of these different forms of knowledge production. It is not just text, and we need to move beyond that. At the institutional, we need standardization in and access to that training. And again, in that access, we have to think about the labor roles that are provided. It's not just saying, you're the man, so you're going to do the computer science, and the woman is going to do the humanities part. No, it's true access and integration across those points. So I'm hoping over the course of this workshop, we can address those things and move forward. And last slide, Khab Kun Ka. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much for the insightful talk. Are you tired? Okay, so now we open to the floor. Is there any questions from the audience? If you would like to ask questions, you can raise your hand, and that will be the staff will go to you with the mic. มีใครต้องการถามอะไรไหมคะถามภาษาไทยก็ได้นะคะเดี๋ยวช่วยแปลให้ได้ค่ะ Okay. No. All right. So, I'm sorry. And อาจารย์มีไหมคะ
This is a wonderful, very holistic, interdisciplinary information that you have given us. I was wondering, do you have any information to share with us about how the less, how should I use that word, less developed countries make progress in terms of moving towards the more inclusive knowledge base and also inclusive understanding of what digital humanities can do or can help with our common future after this globalization. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really good question. And we modeled this and tested it in various ways. And this will sound obvious, but our data holds up. it's much easier to move to a discipline that you're already a specialist in than to jump over the hoop and do that. That takes a lot more work to try to get to that point. So we see this natural development space, but that doesn't move very quickly. So to really move up the simplex into the other things, you need massive investments that get you along that chain faster, that accelerate your chain along that. Now, there's interesting countries that have done these kinds of jumps and leaps. Ireland is a really interesting example, which had a very terrible economic crisis. It didn't go through the same industrialization pattern. And then when it came out of that with new resources and being one of the richest countries in Europe at that time, it just overinvested. And so it moved into the social very quickly and it invested a lot in this integration and STEM and the humanities. So there are paths to move out of your sort of predetermined space, but it does take extra resources and investments in that to make it happen. Sometimes subsidizing it with partnerships of other people who've already met the goals along your pace. So if you can get those partnerships to get you over, you don't have to buy the equipment, buy the tools. You're just able to kind of jump over into the social application of it.
Maybe we need a different audience for you, like the people, in the funding agencies in this country. I think they need more information of this kind, much more diverse and complex than I think what they usually base their decisions on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My question can be related to hers, as the debate surrounding digital humanities and the popularity of digital humanities. My question is this popularity only sort of contained in people in the humanities only? And how about people in the STEM, how they're dealing with this field? Do they, generally kind of like acknowledge the existence of this field or like inviting us over to their talks? And, how well can we be established, for example, globally and on equal par, with other disciplines? That's my first question. And the second question has something to do with the, what I'm interested, that is the role of university. And, what, in your opinion, how fair, how well this digital humanity fares in, university as a whole? Does it get funding sort of better in the state or in comparison to literature and linguistics or other field of study? Thank you.
It's a great question and one that's very close to my heart. So coming from Georgia Institute of Technology, it was historically an engineering field. So it was engineering and then computer science strength, and the liberal arts college was quite small. Your word popular is a really interesting one because in popularizing our institution and trying to compete for students in the US market, we've moved towards Instagram and TikTok and all those spaces. And do you know what plays really well there? Digital humanities. The students see that and they're excited. It looks fun. It looks interesting. So one of our fastest growing majors at Georgia Tech, which is a historically engineering and computing, is actually our digital humanities sort of space, which combines a computer science degree and a literature, media, and communications degree in one thing. So it's very appealing. It's very sort of fast growing. My concern, though, is if you base all of your recruitment and your execution on popularization. So if everything is just popular and flashy and fun, but you don't kind of have the fundamentals, I think that we might lose something. So part of what I think is the fundamental core of interdisciplinarity is disciplinarity. You can't be interdisciplinary across engineering and the humanities without understanding engineering and the humanities. And so I'm worried sometimes that our interdisciplinarity gets too surface, and that's, I think, a charge for our educational systems to make sure that we are taking people back to the core. So you may be excited about the fun project you can do, but to do that project, you have to know the foundational pieces of it. You have to be well-versed in science and math in order to produce that and create that. So I think we still have an obligation as an institution to meet those demands.
So, so just, my question about the, how well we accepted, for example, people in engineering or medicine.
Oh, right.
What was your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that there's both ways. I think there are people who see the promise of it, but also people who see it as a threat, right? That they feel that they have to now reimagine and make their classes more exciting or more fun, right? And so they see this as sort of a threat, a younger generation threat to the kind of work that they're doing. So I think it's also incorporating it across the curriculum in a way that's not threatening, to say your fundamentals class on, your sort of fundamental computer language programming class is still fundamentally important for this, and you don't have to put in Beyonce to make your course good. We need that course as well. So they have to see that it's not a threat to them, but it's actually utilizing their expertise.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you so much. I'm Pinit Chantalangsi from UNESCO. I'd like to ask you if it is possible and feasible concretely and quickly, for instance, to use the instruments that you have to generate data that we can then apply to Thailand, to Laos, to Cambodia, the region where we are in, because we are lacking information probably, for instance, on the triangle, social, physical, industrial. Do you have already a kind of ready-made template that we can use to collect data of this region, starting from Thailand probably, and then generate information for us to see the trend from this region in particular? Can we, partner with you to see how we can use that to generate data for us to better devise on what we need going forward? Thanks.
Yes.
Great.
You said succinct, but no. So we have all of that data. The charts I showed ended at 2017, but it's a script that we can run. My big concern, and I think this is something that goes to UNESCO, is about creating those observatories that create global information. So we have to base our data on Web of Science or Scopus. We'll use OpenAlex or these other tools, but again, they are very narrow in what they're doing. So a small plug, I'm working on a global meta-science observatory across 7 different countries, and the idea is to source their own data so that when we're creating those maps, they're much more accurate. They don't just reflect one lens on science production, but they actually produce a lens that includes the local language production as well. But yes, we could happily partner on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the questions. So once again, let's give a round of applause for our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much for your insightful talk. And thank you for all the audience and the participation. And please join us for lunch at the ground floor of the Mahachakuri building. Is that correct? ใช่ไหมคะ โอเคค่ะ ขอบคุณทุกท่านนะคะแล้วก็ขอเชิญรับประทานอาหารกลางวันร่วมกันได้นะคะ แล้วก็ถ้ามีคำถามอะไรอีก ขอโทษค่ะ จบหน้าที่ภาษาอังกฤษแล้วค่ะ สวัสดีค่ะ
ครับก็ขอขอบคุณดร. Cassidy Sugimoto กับผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร. เทพยาจินตโกวินนะครับ Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
ครับและในโอกาสนี้ขอเรียนเชิญศาสตราจารย์กิตติคุณดร. สุวรรณาสถาอานันท์มอบของที่ระลึกให้กับทั้งสองท่านครับ
เรียนเชิญอาจารย์ทิพยาด้วยนะคะ
ขอบคุณครับลำดับต่อไปผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร. ทิพยาจินตโกวินครับขอขอบคุณมากเลยนะครับ
ค่ะตลอดช่วงเช้าวันนี้นะคะเราก็ได้พาทุกท่านนะคะไปทำความรู้จักมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลในหลากหลายแง่มุมผ่านทั้งการเสวนาและการปาฐกถาค่ะสำหรับในช่วงบ่ายนะคะก็จะเป็นการนำเสนอโครงการวิจัยจากนักวิจัยนิสิตและเครือข่ายพันธมิตรที่จะจัดขึ้นทั้งหมด2ที่ด้วยกันค่ะคือณศูนย์มนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลแห่งนี้และณห้อง707ชั้น7อาคารบรมราชกุมารีค่ะในช่วงบ่ายนะคะระหว่างเวลา 13:00 นถึง 14:30 นก็จะเป็นการนำเสนอโครงการวิจัย2กลุ่มด้วยกันค่ะกลุ่มที่1ก็คือกลุ่มมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลข้อมูลและตัวตนของศาสตร์ซึ่งจะจัดขึ้นณศูนย์มนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลแห่งนี้ค่ะและกลุ่มที่2มุมมองทางปรัชญาในมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลณห้อง707อาคารบรมราชกุมารีค่ะ
ใช่แล้วครับและลำดับต่อมาเวลา 14:45 นาทีถึง 16:30 นาทีจะเป็นการนำเสนอโครงการวิจัยกลุ่มที่ 3 การอ่านในมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลณศูนย์มนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลและการสาธิตนวัตกรรมทางมนุษยศาสตร์ดิจิทัลจากเครือข่ายพันธมิตรณห้อง 707 อาคารบรมราชกุมารีครับและหลังจากนี้จะเป็นช่วงพักรับประทานอาหารว่างรับประทานอาหารกลางวันขออภัยครับทางคณะอักษรศาสตร์ของเรามีโรงอาหารบริเวณอาคารมหาจักรีสิรินธรที่ทุกท่านสามารถเข้าไปรับประทานอาหารกันได้นะครับแล้วกลับมาเจอกันช่วงบ่ายกับการนำเสนอโครงการวิจัยนะครับสวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีค่ะ